Back with you tonight, you're in Focus. Thanks for staying on. National local government body SALGA has blamed a lack of transparency in coalition agreements between political parties for several instances of instability seen in the metros of Nelson Mandela Bay, Tshwane, and now Johannesburg. South African Local Government Association President Bheki Stofile says the parties should publish terms of agreements as a first order of business to take the public into their confidence. The coalition governments have become a common feature across many municipal areas since the 2021 local government elections. Joining us now to give us a perspective on SALGA's call is public policy expert Mandla Isaacs. Mr. Isaacs, good evening, and thank you very much for your time and for joining us tonight here on In Focus. Would you say a lack of transparency in the coalition agreements is at the heart of what is surrounding what we are seeing right now in terms of the instability in the various metros?
I think it is a factor, but I don't think it's the major factor, and I don't believe, public transparent agreements, publicly provided agreements would be the biggest lever to improving stability of coalitions. Look, the coalition politics is relatively new in South Africa, and it seems as if it's going to be the trend in the years to come. It's very important to understand, what are the factors that drive stability or instability of coalitions. The biggest factor is going to be the balance of power. The more players that you have in a governing coalition, the more potentially unstable it can be. There's more stakeholders to manage, more egos to manage, and more opportunities for somebody to derail things. And as we see in Johannesburg, when you have a coalition that relies on even parties with one or even two seats, those parties then have enormous leverage to extract concessions. So I think that, the agreements could help, but it's not going to change the fundamental picture. It's the political culture and maturity of the parties is going to be a much bigger factor. What
is in those agreements? What's entailed in those agreements? Because, what we have been hearing, for example, now is that the coalition agreement is that we vote together, and these guys decided to go rogue and they didn't vote with us. Or in the coalition agreement, we raise issues within that body. So if you're unhappy, for example, with the conduct of the speaker or the conduct of the mayor, you don't go to the press and begin to speak by yourself. You must raise it within that forum. Is that the sum total of what's in those agreements, or is there more?
Well, the agreements will cover a lot of things. They'll cover things like, representation in key offices in the legislative bodies and in the executive. They can cover things like key policy issues, how much, what kind of concessions are going to be allowed, what might be the policy red lines that different coalition partners will insist on. And then, of course, some of the process steps like the ones you mentioned. But, of course, it's politics. These parties, as much as they're in a coalition together, they're vying for visibility, they're vying for credibility. They want to make their mark on events, and they want to be known for, to make put their stamp on public affairs and be recognized by voters. So it's going to be very difficult for them to constrain themselves to gentlemen's agreements. There's always an incentive to go rogue potentially.
Yeah. So, in simple terms, what you're saying there is that parties are afraid that they might get electoral backlash depending on what they've agreed to.
Well, it's sort of a double-edged sword that parties face when they're in coalitions. You could potentially get backlash for being seen as irresponsible or derailing government and distracting the political sphere from delivering to citizens, but you could also be, face electoral backlash for being seen as too cozy with different parties. Remember, part of politics is about drawing distinctions. We are like this, we're for A, B, and C, we're different to these other parties. But then when you govern in coalition with them, it's very easy for those distinctions to be blurred. And your voters may say, I voted for you. I didn't vote for those other fellows. I wanted a particular type of government. In the UK, the Liberal Democrats, were in a coalition with the Tories, and they faced, they withered away in the subsequent elections because voters no longer saw the distinction between the Liberal Democrats and the Tories and said, well, I'll just vote for the Tories or I'll vote for Labour. But you just seem like I might as well vote for the Tories if I vote for you. So, parties are always kind of jockeying for position to try to distinguish themselves and try to sharpen those distinctions. So it's very difficult to think an agreement you can make a political agreement shortly after an election, and that's going to govern how you all interact with one another for the next 5 years. There's lots of events and opportunities for division that can arise in that time.
Yeah. And for us, the public, for us, the voters, how do we know who has reneged on an agreement? Because you would hear them then come out and say, no, that particular individual now has decided to vote with the former ruling party, much to the detriment of the service delivery in the metro. And as the public, we are not really sure who has reneged on what agreement and what arrangement.
It's sort of that's a major question. I think what underlies that question is you have this political spectrum, and parties are now going to have to start making key decisions about where do they reside, right? So you have people who voted maybe for Action SA or for COPE or IFP. They didn't vote. They weren't voting for the DA or for the ANC. And so now, after the election, when their party gets in bed with some of these parties, this creates this exact question of when citizens cast their vote, what were they expecting? And so parties are going to have to, as you say, be much more transparent with voters before elections about what kind of coalition arrangements they would entertain and which they would not entertain. And then they will be held accountable for were they seen to be responsible, were they honest brokers, did they take positions that were principled and rooted in their policy platforms and their manifestos, or were they simply being opportunistic and playing palace politics for their own gain?
Are there parameters that should be attached to these coalition partnerships? I'll tell you why. For example, there's been a suggestion that says I don't know, I think it's in one of the countries in the UK or somewhere in Europe, where what makes that coalition work is that there is a certain period to which you are tied into the coalition agreement, that before this period expires, you cannot, for example, move out of that coalition. So whatever happens for 12 months, you remain in that coalition. And that is a parameter that is set. I don't think we've got something like that here in South Africa. We've got a way in which if the DA can make a deal with Action SA and EFF or whoever, tomorrow the ANC can come up with a better deal and say, no, we'll give you speaker here, we'll give you mayor here. And all of a sudden, it's all systems go and things can change overnight, which many are saying creates a lot of instability because then you'll find metros constantly changing administration and leadership.
I would really emphasize that I don't believe there are going to be legalistic solutions to this kind of challenge. For me, the challenge is political. If you look at other countries with proportional representation systems like Germany, Israel, and Italy comes to another one that comes to example. All of those countries have faced situations where they have fractious coalitions, where there's a question of how long the government will be able to remain, if a party pulls out and there's an early election or a vote of no confidence. And this becomes, part of the political process and political cycle. And so what the mechanism, to your point, to stop that is parties can be punished at the polls. If voters decide, look, I voted for you, I'm observing you, I don't feel that you've been negotiating in good faith, I don't feel that you've operated in this coalition in such a way to achieve stability and keep the focus on addressing citizens' concerns. If voters start to feel that parties that they voted for are contributing to instability and being wasteful with their mandate, then what will happen is that voters will not give them their vote at the next election. So I would emphasize that the solution to this is political. Voters will reward or punish parties based on how responsible they were in government, even if that's in a coalition.
So SALGA is proposing a framework that could possibly be looking at prescribing decision-making procedure, dispute resolution mechanism to help the ongoing coalition bargaining process. Do you think that would help?
Look, I think it could help provide some guardrails, perhaps, for parties to work within. This is fairly new territory. We haven't seen too many of these coalitions. And so this is something that's arisen over the last couple of cycles. So, sure, if there were some guardrails, some procedural norms that we could agree on that might ease certain matters and create and minimize some of the running around to court that we've seen of who's a speaker, who's an acting speaker, do you have a right to call certain motions? Look, that could help. But in the main, as I say to you, Thabo, if you have a coalition with, 5, 6, 7, 8 parties that have to stay in the same page, agree on things like spending, agree on disciplinary issues where there's controversies, agree on, policy questions, it becomes very difficult to keep all of that agreement. Even if you start an election and you agree, it becomes very difficult to maintain that agreement when you have a multitude of parties with different ideological bents. So for me, I think that, that is the bigger factor around those structural questions around balance of power, more so than these kind of legalistic solutions like agreements. Because those agreements simply can't anticipate all of the different political issues that can arise, in a dynamic political sphere like we have.
Does the idea of multi-party governments, because, they are now, from what I'm hearing, a lot of them quite averse to this idea of a DA-led coalition or a party-led coalition. They're saying we're a multi-party government. Does it present a dilemma on who takes accountability when there's lack of delivery?
It does create a dilemma, and, that's why I said that, coalitions are a double-edged sword, because when you're now in the camp together, it's very difficult to say you're part of a coalition government, but you are not accountable. Some things where, that's the DA, that's not us. Once you're part of the government, at some point you have to be collectively accountable. You're part of that executive committee, right? If you're an MMC or an MEC, or eventually if we have a coalition at national level, if you're part of a multi-party cabinet. So, that the distinctions becomes a bit difficult for parties to say, this is what I'm responsible and accountable for, and these are the successes that are attributed to me, and these are the failures or mistakes that I don't want to be attributed to me, even though I was in government. So it does create a level of complexity.
Mandla Isaacs, appreciate your input tonight. That is the public policy expert there, Mandla Isaacs, helping us with that conversation. This is SALGA is proposing some kind of framework that would certainly speak into decision-making, conflict resolution, and some of the key issues that govern how coalitions will work.